Seoul is hosting top U.S. diplomatic and defense officials this month amid heightened concerns over North Korea's weapons collaborations and its planned third spy satellite launch. So what is the latest with regard to Pyongyang's planned third launch? What can be done to address its blatant violations of UN Security Council resolutions? And what are the broader implications of North Korea closing a number of its overseas diplomatic missions? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. Today we touch upon diplomatic engagements amid efforts to better address security entanglements, if I may, with our foreign journalists. For this, I have Steven here in the studio with me. Steven, welcome.
Good afternoon.
I also have Jacco with us. Jacco, it's been a while. Welcome back.
Hello, thanks for having me again.
Right, Steven, we'll begin with diplomatic matters then. So Foreign Minister Park Jin is poised to host US Secretary of State Antony Blinken starting later this evening here in Seoul. What issues, Steven, look to top their agenda?
Last I checked, the Foreign Ministry had not released the official details of their agenda, but I think we can be pretty sure that recent movements involving North Korea will be pretty high on their agenda. The US and South Korea have recently flagged what they say were exchanges of arms between Russia and North Korea, and I think there's a lot of concern about a potential technical advisory role that Russia could play in North Korea's weapons development. I've spoken to some experts who say that North Korea has a lot to gain from technical assistance from Russia in these areas, and that could make a kind of substantive difference to their weapons development. But I believe this is the first trip here by a U.S. Secretary of State in more than 2 years. And so I think on a symbolic level and on a rhetorical level, we'll hear a lot about the U.S. ongoing commitment to defending South Korea. Under the previous U.S. administration, there was some questions as to whether the U.S. was as steadfastly committed to that as they had been in the past. But under President Biden and under President Yoon, the two sides have been very resolute and very clear in their messaging that they are committed to working together. When Yoon traveled to the U.S. earlier this year, they came away with the nuclear consultative agreement. And so I expect Blinken's visit to be a kind of continuation along this path.
Right. And Jacco, I'm going to expand on something that Steven just talked about, Russia's technical assistance to North Korea. South Korean intelligence authorities claim that North Korea is poised to make a third attempt at placing a spy satellite into orbit, and that this planned mission may actually be a success. Do you suppose Moscow has indeed shared its rocket know-how with Pyongyang? And if that is the case, how worried should we be, do you think?
Yeah, well, when Kim Jong-un visited Russia in September, Russia's President Vladimir Putin said that he would help the DPRK to launch satellites. And that was, of course, after Russia's Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu visited a military parade and checked out the military hardware in Pyongyang back in July. And then most recently in October, we had Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov also visiting Pyongyang to talk with Kim Jong-un and his Foreign Minister Choi Son-hee. So we have three very significant and public shows of support from Russia for North Korea. But apart from the claims by the South Korean National Intelligence Service, I haven't seen any specific details yet that show exactly what sort of technical support Russia has given North Korea. Now, according to National Assembly member Yu Sang-bom, who was in a closed-door intelligence briefing by the NIS recently, he said that the North appears to have received technical assistance from Russia and is likely checking the launch vehicle's engine and the launch mechanism before trying for a third time to launch the satellite that failed twice this year. But he didn't give any more specific information about what sort of technical help may have been received, probably for security reasons. So in short, we don't know exactly what kind of tech Russia has shared with North Korea, but it seems that given these shows of support and that Russia has said, or Putin said, we will help, they probably are, and maybe there's some kind of a tit-for-tat deal with North Korea in exchange for military hardware or bullets or shells that it has sent to Russia for the war against Ukraine. Now, how worried should we be? I'm not a sower of panic seeds, so I would say that, of course, the government should be concerned because it's not a good thing, but the average citizen need not be too worried by it.
Right. And Stephen, as Jacco mentioned, intelligence authorities here claim that North Korea may have shipped some 2,000 containers of weapons to Russia, including short-range ballistic missiles. Is there nothing, Stephen, that the international community can do to perhaps curb North Korea's blatant violations of UN Security Council resolutions?
Well, the nature of those resolutions and of all kind of international law is that they are not enforceable in any practical way. These are, at the end of the day, these are sovereign countries, and if they decide to trade between them, they can do that. What we are left with is sanctions. I mean, North Korea and Russia are pretty tightly sanctioned already. I believe in the intro we heard about how North Korea has recently closed some of their embassies in a couple of African countries, and there were reports also of Spain and Hong Kong, and some experts have interpreted that as a sign that these sanctions are biting, perhaps harder than in the past. So really what the international community can do is attempt to cut off Russia and North Korea even further from the international financial system, to make it harder for them to import things that they need for their militaries and to export things that they could profit from. And other than that, there's the oldest diplomatic tool in the shed, which is persuasion, which is trying to convince them that they would be better off not doing this, that they would be better off taking a different tack and engaging more productively with the outside world on economic matters, and in seeking to enrich themselves that way. That's a very tall task. I mean, both of these countries seem to be pretty determined to pursue aggressive actions that the rest of the world does not approve of. But at the end of the day, that's what it comes down to, unless we're going to wage war. And I don't think anybody really wants another war.
Right, of course not. And Jacco, speaking within your capacity as the host of a podcast on North Korea, what have pundits on your show been saying about ways to better stem North Korea's flagrant violations of Security Council resolutions?
Yeah, a lot of people that I've spoken to point to China and Russia as the main enablers of what's seen as North Korea's bad behavior. Now, North Korea, of course, by itself kind of thumbs its nose at UN resolutions and sanctions. It says, we're a sovereign state, we'll do what we choose according to our national interests. So a threat of sanctions really do little to put fear into the hearts of the leaders in Pyongyang. And with China and Russia helping North Korea to flout sanctions and resolutions, people point to those two countries because without their active assistance, sanctions enforcement falls quite flat. Now, on episode 304 of the NK News podcast, I actually interviewed Eric Penton-Vogt, who was the former coordinator of the United Nations panel of experts into looking at North Korean sanctions and how they're enforced and how they're evaded. And what I learned from him, amongst other things, is that sanctions need to be reinforced by every individual member state of the United Nations. It's not up to 1 or 2 or even 5 nations. Sanctions only work if everybody follows the line. So the United Nations Secretary General may try to use his bully pulpit to name and shame countries that don't enforce sanctions. But I think that he may have bigger and more urgent fish to fry at this time in the world. So that's probably unlikely. So otherwise, the UN might want to consider just accepting that sanctions enforcement will always be flawed and full of holes, as long as there are states that are willing to help North Korea to get around them.
Right, indeed. And Jacco, as Stephen mentioned, the regime, North Korea, has closed quite a number of its diplomatic missions abroad, including in Angola and over in Spain as well. Pundits here claim that the move itself is a reflection of these sanctions that you mentioned, of the financial struggles of keeping them afloat, these diplomatic missions. What do you say?
Yes, it certainly could be a reflection of financial difficulties. We have seen this before during the Great Famine in North Korea in the mid-1990s. About 10 overseas embassies and diplomatic offices were closed, and that was due to financial difficulties, according to Tae Yong-ho, who himself was a former North Korean diplomat. But also over the years, North Korea has opened and closed embassies in various places, depending or in line with its current strategies and business focuses. So, for example, in 2002, North Korea opened an embassy in Canberra, Australia. and then it closed that embassy only 6 years later in 2008, citing financial difficulties. And I think that North Korea had hoped that trade and investment from Australia to North Korea would be greater than it turned out to be. And so when that didn't pay off, it switched its focus in choosing instead to reopen its embassy in Myanmar, which had been closed for more than 20 years since the Rangoon bombing of 1983. So sometimes focuses shift, and that can be another reason for it. Now, Tae Yong-ho's memoir about his time as a North Korean diplomat, he talks about his experience in trying to raise money. He said that every North Korean embassy overseas has to be financially self-sufficient and also able to send money back to Pyongyang for various purposes. So it's commonly understood that embassies have to be making money, whether that be through open trade activities or through illicit means like smuggling cigarettes that are duty-free, for example. So it could be that those embassies in Uganda and Angola and Spain weren't making much money anymore and sort of decided to close them down and focus elsewhere. Closing the consulate in Hong Kong was a bit of a surprise to me. I didn't expect to see that happen. But we may not know why that was chosen for some time, and it's a little bit opaque at this stage. So it's certainly the first multiple embassy closure at the same time that we've seen in decades, and that certainly it could be a sign of probably reflects financial difficulties. And it's not a good thing. I mean, North Korea shutting itself off from the world means that it tends to become more insular, more isolated, less communication with other countries. So that's not a positive thing that we should be applauding. We should be trying to see North Korea connecting with the outside world and getting more voices in.
Right, indeed. Moving forward, Stephen, last year, the APEC summit was interrupted by a North Korean missile test, which led to the opening of a crisis meeting. This year, the summit comes amid fresh fighting between Israel and Hamas. Do you believe a joint statement of sorts may be possible at the APEC, which starts, I believe, this coming weekend, with regard to the conflict in the Middle East?
I'm not much in the prediction business, but I would say that it will be quite challenging. When the APEC finance ministers convened earlier this year, they were not able to issue a joint statement due to objections from China and Russia on wording as pertaining to Ukraine. I attended the G20 in India in September, and the consensus leading up to that meeting was that the leaders were unlikely to be able to reach a statement, agree on a statement because of those same kinds of objections. But in the end, they did put out a joint statement which contained some kind of softened language on Ukraine. So will the leaders at the APEC summit be able to reach a similar kind of compromise? They might. I think the hosts and the people who are invested in the carrying out of these kinds of meetings are, I think, doing everything they can because it reflects better on them if they're able to come up with some kind of tangible results. But as we all know, the world we live in is really kind of, it seems like growingly divided on a number of very contentious issues. You know, we had the war in Ukraine, we had China's role in the world as pertains to the economy and to security, and now the conflict in the Middle East is, I think, more central in the global conversation than it's been in a very long time, at least since maybe 2006 or so, if not even longer. And that situation is dragging on. It's perhaps not quite as intense as it was a week or two ago, but it's still something that warrants some sustained attention. And will that make it impossible for leaders to strike a kind of mutually agreeable statement? I think it very well might, but I'm interested to see what happens.
Right, indeed. And staying within the APEC framework, Stephen, do you suppose that broader economic interests within this particular framework and among its members, of course, including the US and China, will perhaps keep these two superpowers from dwelling too much on their security differences?
That's a kind of optimistic suggestion, I think, when you look at the US-China relationship, when you just take a step back and factor into just how much economically is at stake, how many companies have interests in both countries, and just how much trade goes back and forth between the two countries. You would think that that would provide a strong incentive to want to cooperate and want to put security concerns aside. The U.S., again, as they often seem to be, are getting ready for another election. And so I think Biden wants to do everything he can to have some strong economic figures heading into the election. So now there is never a good time for a trade war, but I think now is particularly bad time for trade friction with China. We've seen in recent years the complications presented by disruptions to supply chains as pertains to important items like semiconductors. I don't think anybody wants to go down that road. So if I was advising the leaders of either country, I would be advising them to focus on the things that they have in common, focus on areas of potential mutual gain, and try to leave all but the most pressing security concerns off the table. For now, APEC is primarily a forum for discussion of economic matters. So that will definitely be a big issue to watch over the weekend.
Right. Back here in the country, Jacco, U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin is poised to arrive in the country next week, I believe, for the security consultative meeting with his counterpart, Defense Minister Shin Won-sik. What looks to top their talks, Jacco, do you think?
Yeah, so these are annual meetings, as you pointed out. They're the annual security consultative meetings between the two ministers of defense. Now, as the readout from the U.S. Department of Defense said, issues that are top of mind for both of those officials are, number one, efforts by both the United States and the Republic of Korea to maintain a strong combined defense posture to deter and respond to DPRK nuclear and missile threats. That's the first thing, which is pretty much the same every year. And the second thing is the importance of expanding regional cooperation between the United States and the Republic of Korea, including US, ROK, Japan trilateral security cooperation. And that's something that we've seen really under President Yoon as being an area of focus, and also in the Camp David meetings earlier this year too. So those are two very important topics for them to talk about. Now, last month, the US and Korea commemorated 70 years since the signing of the Mutual Defense Treaty in 1953. So that's a very celebratory mood right now, and the attitude, I imagine, between the two defense officials are very collegial and positive these days. Also, the Republic of Korea UN Command Member States Defense Ministerial meeting is taking place at the same time, and that's a meeting of member states of the UN Command, which was established in 1950 to help South Korea stopping the invasion by North Korea. I haven't seen any more details of this particular meeting yet and what we can expect there, and I'm not even sure which member states will be present, so we'll find out in due course. Now, at the same time as visiting Korea, Lloyd Austin will also visit India and Indonesia, and this is part of Washington putting a real strategic focus and emphasis on the Indo-Pacific region. And in both these countries, he'll be meeting with the defense ministers there, and ASEAN talks in Indonesia. While in India, the meeting will also involve the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, and his Indian counterpart. So these are three big meetings taking place all in the Indo-Pacific region, once again reinforcing that for the United States, this is an important area of global affairs and its own defense strategy.
Right, indeed. Across the border in North Korea, Stephen, the regime has designated, I believe, November 18th, a day to mark last year's testing of its Hwasong-17 ICBM. Could you tell us more about this designation and its potential implications?
It comes across to me as just a further entrenchment of the military and of weaponry into the kind of, not just the political identity of the country, but the general, public life of the country. I mean, we're talking about a military-first political system, a kind of military-first society. If I could, I would borrow some from some analysis that Jacco offered earlier, that this is, in a normal country, in a democracy, leaders might say to their constituents that, we've improved the economy, we've improved infrastructure, we have, better schools, better hospitals, but North Korea kind of presents these achievements in weaponry as a sign that the state is working to protect the citizenry. I guess the North Korean government does not see its role as delivering well-being or happiness in a kind of broadly defined manner. It sees its job as delivering security. And so perhaps what they're seeking to do here is show the people of the country that while they do not enjoy prosperity as much of the rest of the world enjoys it, they are not rich, they are not free in a number of ways, they do not enjoy the civil and political rights of people in lots of other countries, but the state is working to protect them. And, you can make an argument that the primary role of any state anywhere in the world is to first and foremost provide security. So I would understand it along those lines.
Right. Jacco, November 18th would be next Saturday, if I'm not mistaken, and they're calling this the Missile Industry Day, I believe. Do you suppose we're looking ahead to a potential missile testing on that particular day?
Yeah, I don't like to make predictions, but there is a school of thought that says that North Korea periodically tests a missile or does something else that South Korea and the United Nations Command deems provocative because they don't feel that they're getting enough attention and they want more attention. But I don't yet see any signs at the moment that North Korea particularly wants attention or is looking for talks or to leverage something or to gain concessions. So I don't anticipate missile launches or similar acts, but of course there can always be internal reasons why they may test a missile, which could be to perfect a particular type of technology, such as a re-entry vehicle or a solid rocket engine or the hypersonic glide structures. And of course we have the satellite launch coming up, which we thought might be coming up in October, but it didn't happen. So that may happen in the next month or two. Now, North Korea's leadership might decide that now is not the time to be launching missiles into the sea because Russia and China, they're busy getting their own house in order, but there's also a big focus on what's happening in Ukraine and in Gaza. But with the general elections coming up next April in South Korea, we may see an attempt by North Korea to influence local politics by doing something that is deemed to be threatening here in the South. That wouldn't surprise me, but again, no specific predictions from me. We'll just have to wait and see. These are all possible, and they're things that we've seen before, so they may happen again.
Right. So
if I could jump in and ask a quick question, how much influence do you think North Korea potentially holds over public opinion here? Because I just feel like a local election is typically dominated by local concerns. So were there to be a North Korean provocation of some kind, just to what extent do you think that could sway the way people vote ahead of that?
It's a great question. I'm not a pollster, so I don't know to what extent those public opinion can be swayed, but I do know that back in the 1990s there was a belief here on the conservative side of politics in South Korea that any behavior threatening by North Korea would increase the focus in South Korean voters on security issues and then would lead to more votes for the conservative side. Now, whether that's actually true, it's hard to test that because you need to have, ideally two situations and with a minimal difference, but I'm not sure.
Right. All right. Well, I suppose that's all the time we have for this edition. Thank you so much, Jacco, as always, for your insights. And Stephen, thank you very much for your time and thoughts.
Thank you.
Right. Well, that ends this edition of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching. See you same time tomorrow.